I'm Doug Topkin, host of a new Verisk podcast series on business issues related to the COVID-19 pandemic. As the pandemic continues, governments, businesses, and people are figuring out how to manage its impacts on humankind, the economy, and business around the world. To do that, access to reliable data is critical. In today's podcast, we'll provide some perspective on the numbers and projections we're seeing in the news every day and different factors that come into play regarding their accuracy. With me today is Doug Fulham, Director of Life and Health Modeling at AIR. Doug is closely involved with the AIR pandemic model, which is providing forward-looking simulations of potential COVID-19 impact. Thanks for being with us today, Doug. To start, let's talk about the pandemic models that are out there and the different projections and numbers being generated. How can we know which models to trust?
Well, thank you for having me. And it's definitely tough. Different models have different levels of detail, and sometimes even for the ones that are dealing with this every single day, reading through all of the little nuances about it is very challenging. What are they trying to estimate? Where are they pulling their data from? It all gets muddier and muddier to distinguish between the two, and we fully understand that. We should note that when you're trying to build these models, there's kind of three major areas that you want to make sure that you take into consideration. You want to have models and assumptions. You want to have it validate well, and you want to have good data to trust that you're pulling from. So if you don't have good data, it's an old adage, garbage in equals garbage out. Is it reasonable that we are getting? Is it coming from a reputable source? All that kind of stuff is super important to make sure you understand. When you talk about these methods and assumptions and things that go into that aspect of it, we really want to make sure that your methods and the practices that the model is incorporating into the system really adhere to what you'd expect in reality as best as possible. So all models are simplifications, but it really should try to make sense when you're looking at the parts and the moving aspects of it. And then you need to make sure it validates well. Does it make sense when you look at this event relative to historical events, or is the results that are coming out of that seem implausible or just unrealistic? All that kind of stuff is moving within the system. And so understanding these models becomes very challenging. But this is why we do have experts in the field, and people that are at this level do try to make sure they can provide valid information to people. And you should really get your information from multiple sources to help kind of bring an aggregate sense of the results together.
So there must be plenty of factors that these models take into account. Can you give us a few examples of some of the tangible factors as well as intangible factors that are looked at?
Sure. A few different things that are going on there. So you would really want to try and think about, the transmission rate. So how quickly is this thing spreading from one person to the next? That's super important to understand. These things do grow exponentially. And so thinking about how it spreads from one person to two people to four people is super important to understand. But you also need to understand, how it's connected from different places. How are we connected from, let's say New York City to London? Or how is London connected to Milan? Or how is Milan connected to pretty much any other place in the world? So you really need to understand the transmission rate, kind of this global scale of connectivity that we have. We also need to understand the response metrics that we're doing. So how are we responding to it in the US versus how is Italy responding, or China, or Egypt, any of these kind of countries? That'll affect the continual spreading of the impact. And then we also need to think about it from historical contexts. How are we thinking about this event, and how does it spread relative to what we know today and maybe the technology that we have today versus maybe technology of the past? And so all of those parts are challenging in their own right, but they really allow for a detailed assessment of what's going on. And so if you kind of could put them all together, you can really understand where the event might be heading in the next week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, etc.
Well, we've certainly been hearing a lot about transmission rates. Can you explain to me what that really means?
Sure. So let's think of it as a nice little city that we're all in, and you hadn't come into contact, with 50 people or 100 people over a given time period. And the question is, how quickly do you spread it from yourself to the other person? And so normally there's a couple of different metrics that epidemiologists use. One of the main ones that you might hear is the transmission rate. Sometimes it's just denoted as R standing for the word reproduction. And when we talk about that, you have the R naught, which is the transmission rate at the beginning of the outbreak, when pretty much everybody in society is susceptible to the pathogen. It can be spread from one person to the next without any slow up from maybe herd immunity of past outbreaks, things of that nature. And so in essence, let's say the transmission rate's 2. So that means the first person that's sick will spread it onto 2 other people. Those 2 people will spread it onto 2 more people each. So you go from 1 person to 2 people to 4 people to 8 people, etc. And it grows in this exponential fashion. And as it's growing, it's spreading to more and more people. Over time, though, as we start implementing different things, maybe a vaccine comes online. And so we effectively can reduce the transmission rate because we can inoculate some portion of the population. Maybe people who got sick and are now better maybe have their own immunity to it. And so it kind of reduces the transmission because everybody in the population is no longer becoming infectious. And you get to the concept of herd immunity. And so this is in essence how it spreads. And at the beginning of the outbreak is generally the worst time, and then it slows up over time. So it starts out with very high transmissions and then comes down. The objective is to really get less than 1. When that rate is lower than 1, the outbreak will slow down. So if we think of 1,000 people are infected and that rate is less than 1, let's say it's 0.8, then 1,000 people will only spread it onto 800 more people. And those 800 people might only spread it onto 640 more people, and it'll kind of come to an end on its own. This is kind of the natural progression that outbreaks have over time.
Interesting. What are your thoughts on underreporting? Can that account for unexplained variations in the numbers from different countries or states?
Yeah, so we should be mindful that pretty much any historical event, any material size has underreporting. It's just kind of a nature of the beast that we have to deal with. This has been borne out study after study looking at historical outbreaks. So the same is true for this event. Underreporting does vary between countries, but what we should know is that what you hear in the news are generally speaking what you get as laboratory confirmed tests. But if you really understand the bigger aggregate picture, you should think of that as the tip of the iceberg. And a lot of epidemiologists are really trying to infer what the actual case size is. So one way to do this is we can think about it from antibody tests, and they're starting to do more and more of those. And they can tell us how many people have antibodies for the given pathogen. We can also look at other aspects. We can look at how quickly it spreads from country to country, and that can kind of give us a sense of how many actual cases might be out there. And then we also think about it that generally speaking, there's differences between well-resourced countries and poor-resourced countries. Countries with greater resources and better healthcare infrastructure will likely have lower underreporting, but countries with poorer healthcare infrastructure will have higher underreporting. Each of them will have underreporting, but the scale will be different.
What about variations in some countries that have as many reported cases as others, but far fewer deaths?
Yeah, there's no real easy answer to this, unfortunately. There can be differences in reportings. So in certain countries, maybe doctors are really focused on making sure they list everything and add the COVID-19 as one of the causes of death. Other countries might not list that, and they just maybe list the primary cause. We should note that if you do have COVID-19 disease, a lot of times that can come with other things, and the person might die of something specific, such as a heart attack, or they might die of acute respiratory distress syndrome or something like that. So maybe COVID-19 led to the heart attack or whatever the case may be, but sometimes the doctors might not record COVID-19 as the cause of death. And so there's problems with that. There's also, going back to the underreporting, certain countries are going to have a harder time reporting than other countries. And then there's also issues about how far along in the outbreak. So generally speaking, in the very early stages, there's going to be more difference between the deaths relative to cases than you are maybe later in the outbreak. And this has to do with the fact that generally speaking, you get sick and then it might take a few weeks to die from the event. And so usually you see the cases before you see the deaths. So you can see a wider range at the start of the outbreak.
Sure, got it. Tell me about population density. How does it play a role in the spread of the virus?
There are a lot of things that play a role, but population density is one of them. It stands to reason that if you live in a more densely populated area, you just naturally come in contact with more people per day. Wherever you're walking on the street, there's probably more people that you're passing. Maybe you live in an apartment building where you all ride in the same elevator, all that kind of stuff. So a person that maybe lives in a more rural countryside may only come in contact with a dozen people in a given day on average, but a person who might be living in an urban environment may come in contact with 40 people, 50 people, 60 people. And so just by that sheer contact that you have, and potentially even being in more confined spaces, because generally speaking, denser cities have smaller size homes and smaller apartment buildings than the rest, there's more likely chance that you're going to be in close contact with somebody. And when somebody coughs, they could spread it on to you or vice versa. And so naturally, there's just more transmission within that.
There's talk the spread of the virus may slow as temperatures get warmer. Will seasonality affect the virus, Doug?
Seasonality affects virus transmissions, yes. So you do see this, especially, let's take the normal flu that happens every year or general flu, seasonal flu. Generally speaking, we do see it be more intense in the winter, less intense in the summer. This is really not anything surprising to most people. That being said, when we think about general seasonal flu, transmission rates aren't as high. So this event has transmission rates in what we, going back to what we talked about before, R naught factors somewhere in the mid 2s. But usually seasonal flu might be a little bit in the low 1s, meaning 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, et cetera. And so if that golden objective is to get less than 1, it's a lot easier to get from maybe 1.2 down to less than 1. There's less social distancing that needs to happen. There's less isolation and quarantining that needs to happen to kind of reduce that transmission. They're getting something from 2.5 all the way down to 1. And so just the seasonality of maybe we spend less time indoors with each other, we have less contact with each other, or at least when we do, it's further apart from each other, will naturally help bring that transmission rate down. And so, we do see that, and we kind of expect at least some level of seasonality to play a role here, but we shouldn't think of it as being the silver bullet that's going to reduce that transmission rate down from 2.5 all the way below 1. We really need to think about it as a multitude of factors that are interacting to help reduce the transmission.
I didn't want to end our podcast today before you could tell us about the Verisk COVID projection tool.
Yeah, of course. So it's Verisk COVID-19 dashboard. And this tool effectively is designed to give information to all 7+ billion people around the world. We want people to take the information and use it to whatever benefit themselves or their community. So if we're talking about the insurance community, obviously we want, whether it's the P&C industry or the life and health industries, to take that information and try to understand what that means to impact to their particular business, whether it be life, health, workers' comp, liability, whatever the case may be. And they can kind of get a sense of what different scenarios would produce severities of low, moderate, and high. But obviously, if we extend beyond that, the public sector of trying to make plans for how the event might happen and unfold in the next month or so, use that information to better make decisions and hopefully help reduce the impact that this event has, or even just for the average person who's trying to learn more information about this, about might be coming, just for their own edifications, they can log in, get information from that, and they can even ask us questions. So there's an email that they can click and shoot notes out, and we do try to be responsive to that as much as possible and provide more detailed information if they want. So it's really just kind of our own way of helping the global community and some kind of get additional feedback, get information, and if we can have a benefit to society, that's all the better.
Right. I'd like to understand more about this model and your approach in building it. Can you tell me something about, what goes into building the model, the approach that you take?
So the baseline of the model is called an SEIR model. Sometimes that's abbreviated as SIR model. But what it stands for is susceptible, exposed, infectious, and removed. And if you think about how a person would progress from being potentially infected to potentially getting better or unfortunately dying, they're going to go down this path of being first susceptible, then they'll become exposed, then infectious, and then removed out of the population. And as I mentioned, removed can be death or get better. And so, in essence, the modeling is taking that information, and when people become infectious, it then allows it to spread onto susceptible people, and they will become exposed. The infectious people will move to the R category, removed. The E people will become I, and they'll kind of cycle through this over and over again. This model allows us to implement the impact within cities in different parts of the world, because each city is going to be in their own unique place during the outbreak. Some are going to be earlier on in the outbreak, some are going to be later in the outbreak. It also allows us to model the implementation of effective isolation, quarantining, social distancing. We can do that region by region or even city by city. And we can even implement, if and when a vaccine comes available, act that vaccine has by vaccinating part of the susceptible population and effectively removing them from the overall system. And this model is a pretty common framework that people use to really understand how disease spreads from person to person. And it's effectively, we're taking this model, which has been developed many decades ago, but allowing computer simulations to really run through many different iterations that could happen and unfold and provide more detailed analytics to help in whatever the planning may be. Like I said, insurance, public sector, or just general edification.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Doug, and thanks for sharing your insights with us. We certainly appreciate your taking the time to speak with us today. To learn more on this and other COVID-19 related topics, be sure to follow us and visit Varus.com. We hope you enjoyed this podcast and invite you to join us again. Until next time, stay healthy, everyone.